Well, hello, I'm the Amateur Logician, and right now you are viewing my website, amateurlogician.com. We're going to be not so much reviewing a logic textbook, but working through some particular exercises from a particular book that's freely available online. It's a old, traditional, verbal-style logic book, which was recently recommended to me by Professor Jared Casey, who I did an interview with very recently, or at least relatively recently. So if you go to amateurlogician.com and then go to the blog with updates section, sooner or later there you should see the interview with Professor Jared Casey. I had recently the pleasure and honor to do a short email interview with him. He's retired now, but he's still very prolific. He's written many, many books. He's a philosopher and logician. He's taught logic, for example, at University Dublin in Ireland and at other universities as well. But also he has an excellent course on traditional logic at libertyclassroom.com, and we talk a little bit about that in this short email interview. And I'm very grateful that he agreed to do this. I don't personally know him, but through his own generosity, he agreed to do it. And in many ways, this website is inspired by Jared Casey because he really influenced my thinking on logic. So I definitely recommend his course if you're interested in traditional logic. So we talk about logic, and one question, straightforwardly enough, is the following: what are some good books to get started in logic? And we have, for example, Andrew Bachhumer's Introduction to Logic. It's out of copyright. You can get it online for free. But I also bought a used copy, and if you're like me, you like a physical copy of a book. So right here beside me, I'm opening and closing the book, is Introduction to Logic. Other things being equal, I prefer a physical copy of a book. I don't like reading books on the internet, on a computer screen. An article, that's fine, but a big book, generally speaking, no. I prefer the hard copy. There's less distractions. And personally, aesthetically, I like a physical book. So you can still get one. I got one fairly easily, so I'm sure you'll be able to do so as well. But anyways, we talk about other things in this interview, but he recommended this book to me, so I purchased it, and I've been looking through it, and I like it a lot. It's very, very good, and I want to do some exercises with you all from this book on comprehension and extension. So let's just go to archive.org, and I will post a link to this so you can read it yourself. You can view the book yourself. For example, the author writes in Chapter 2, considerations of comprehension and extension pervade the whole of logic, and a correct understanding of them is absolutely necessary if we are to build our logic on a sound basis. Absolutely. So let's think about comprehension, extension, and their inverse relationship. This is Chapter 2, Section 2, so to speak. So the author writes, on the one hand, we can consider the quiddity, essence, or nature signified by a term directing our attention to the intelligible elements involved in it, that is, to its definition and properties. If we do this, we are considering the comprehension of the term and of the concept signified by the term as when we think of a triangle as a plane figure bounded by three straight lines. We're thinking about quiddity, we're thinking about essence or nature, we're thinking about the whatness. What is it? We're thinking about the definition, basically. On the other hand, we can consider the subjects whose quiddity, that is, essence or nature, is signified by the term as when we think of a triangle as being either equilateral, isosceles, or scalene. If we do this, we are considering its extension. Just more generally, extension is about the individual members that happen to have that particular quiddity. So if we're thinking about men, the extension of men is just the individual men that are out there. That's basically it. It's as simple as that. So continuing with our author on comprehension, the comprehension of a term or concept is the sum total of the intelligible elements of the quiddity signified by the term or concept. These intelligible elements are referred to as notes. This sum total includes, in the first place, the basic elements that a thing has to have in order to be thought of as the kind of thing signified by the term. It includes, in the second place, whatever is deducible from these basic elements. Now, in fact, in traditional logic, a lot of textbooks would refer to this as properties. So you have the basic elements, and then you have the so-called properties. Properties is a technical term in traditional logic. Getting back to the author, comprehension includes nothing that a thing does not have to have in order to be the kind of thing signified by the term. So, for example, let's consider the comprehension of man as our author does. The comprehension of man, for instance, includes rational, sentient, animate, corporeal substance. The notes that are looked upon as the notes that are looked upon as basic to the quiddity of man, together with all the notes that are deducible from these, such as capable of speech, social being, risible, and tool using. Risible meaning capable of laughter. Man cannot be thought of without contradiction as lacking any of the elements belonging to the comprehension of man, in terms of its basic elements. If a man lacked any element of the comprehension of man, he would both be a man and not be a man, which is a contradiction and therefore impossible. Now, there are two notes here the author makes that are important. Notice how capable of speech adds nothing to the comprehension of man, but merely expresses what is in it implicitly and deducible from it. So we're dealing with properties, okay? But also note that just the mere inability to speak does not make one not a man, okay? So these abilities may be underdeveloped as an infant or morons, or accidentally impeded as in the insane. We might say that the full potentiality of a man has not been actualized. So just because the full potentiality of the actual man has not been actualized does not mean he's not a man. So just because someone cannot speak does not mean that person is not a person. Okay, but they still are a rational animal. That's just that certain things have not developed. Okay, there's been some kind of privation. Also, to continue back to the author, the comprehension of man does not include tall, white, and European, for a man can be thought of without contradiction as neither tall nor white nor European. And finally, and this is an important note because we're dealing with what is objective, not what is subjective. The author writes, note that the comprehension of a term is not limited to what we explicitly think of when we grasp the meaning of a term, nor does it include all those implications that we actually deduce from a quiddity. Comprehension is not subjective but objective. It includes all the intelligible elements objectively contained in a quiddity, whether we actually think of them or not. The comprehension of a term usually contains many notes of which we have no explicit knowledge at all. For instance, when an 8-year-old child grasps the quiddity of a right triangle, his concept has many implications of which he is completely ignorant. He does not know that the sum of the interior angles is 180 degrees, and so on and so forth. Next, the author gets into extension. The extension of a term includes the subject signified by the term, its members, right? Extension is either absolute or functional, depending on whether the term is considered in itself and outside of discourse or as part of a proposition. So absolute extension, here we have that, well, I'll just read the author, of course. The absolute extension of a term and concept is the sum total of the subjects, of the actual subjects, as well as the possible subjects whose quiddity, essence, or nature is signified by the term and concept. So the extension of man is just every single man that exists, including fictional men, by the way. Okay, possible subjects. And then we have functional extension. The functional extension of a term or concept includes only those subjects that it actually sets before the mind when it is used in discourse. Okay. In this sense, the extension of a term and concept is said to be universal, particular, or singular. So we can refer to, in a proposition, all men. We can refer to some men, or this particular man, like Socrates. Okay. So we have functional extension. The author writes, this meaning of extension is very important in inference. Okay. And then we can think about the inverse relation of comprehension and extension. I really like this diagram. It's pedagogically useful, showing that, as a rule, there's an inverse relationship between comprehension and extension. So let me just read a little bit of this, and then we'll look at the diagram. In a series in which inferior terms are subordinate to superior terms, as in the series man, animal, organism, body, substance, the greater the comprehension of a term and concept, the less its absolute extension, and vice versa. For instance, the comprehension of man is greater than that of animal. Well, surely, right? Because man is a type of animal, but we have to be more specific. We have to narrow in things. We have to have a greater greater comprehension for man, because we're being more specific, right? Man is a rational animal, therefore man has all the comprehension of animal, and besides that, it also has rational. But the absolute extension of an animal is greater than that of man, for it includes both men and irrational animals. So the diagram on the top of page 21 displays this inverse ratio. So if we think about man, this is a very big comprehension. It must have a bigger comprehension than animal because we're being more specific, right? Man is just one type of animal among many other types of animals that are out there. So big comprehension, but small extension. We're just referring to all the individual men that are out there, basically. Whereas with animal, we have a smaller comprehension, but a bigger extension because we refer both to man and to brood. Or on the other hand, we think about substance. Substance has a very small comprehension. So basically, a substance is a being that exists in itself, in some relatively independent sense. So it exists in itself. It's an individual object we can point to that exists in itself. So it's a very small comprehension, but the extension is very large. So it would include man, brood, plant, mineral, angel, God, okay, and so on. Okay, so let's go through some exercises and preview this at least. So we have number 1, define comprehension and distinguish between the so-called basic notes and the notes that can be derived from these. Okay, so remember, so comprehension, that deals with the quiddity or nature of something. It's the whatness of something. The basic notes that are the essential characteristics of that something, or defining that something. The notes derivable follow from those basic notes. Okay, so for example, man is a rational animal. So remember, the basic notes include rationality and animality. Derivable notes include being able to laugh. Laughter follows from our rationality. Likewise, being able to intelligibly communicate also follows from our rationality, so it is a derivable note, what a lot of logic textbooks would call a so-called property. Number 2, basing your answer on the definition of comprehension, state which term of each of the following pairs has the greater comprehension, unless the comprehension of each is identical, and give the reason for your answer. So, for example, A, triangle, and figure. So what is the greater comprehension? Is it triangle or is it figure? Well, I think clearly triangle has a greater comprehension than figure. Because after all, there are many, many figures out there. Being a triangle is a particular kind of figure, so there are more notes involved. There's greater specificity, ergo it has greater comprehension. For B, we have triangle and plane figure bounded by 3 straight lines. So we can just define a triangle as a plane figure bounded by 3 straight lines, so they have equal comprehension. And with C, we have triangle and plane figure bounded by 3 straight lines, which enclose 3 interior angles that are equal to 2 right angles. Now, I think the author is thinking about only Euclidean triangles, so he might want us to say they're equal in comprehension, but technically, there are non-Euclidean triangles out there. So a Euclidean triangle is just basically a triangle that's drawn on a completely flat surface. But you can have triangles that are drawn on spheres. You have spherical geometry, or you can have triangles in hyperbolic space on hyperbolic surfaces. So in that case, they don't have equal comprehension. Okay, so the latter, plane figure bounded by 3 straight lines, which enclose 3 interior angles that are equal to 2 right angles, that has greater comprehension, strictly speaking, because a triangle does not necessarily have 180 degrees. If it's Euclidean, it has 180 degrees. If it's a spherical triangle, it's a triangle drawn on a sphere, it will actually have angles, interior angles that are greater than 180 degrees, interestingly enough. If it's on a hyperbolic surface, in hyperbolic space, it will have less than 180 degrees. So there is a technicality there when we consider non-Euclidean geometry. I don't think the author considered that technicality, but it actually is there, and it's interesting to note, I think. So what about D, triangle and isosceles triangle? Well, isosceles triangle, that has greater comprehension than triangle. So all isosceles triangles are triangles, but not all triangles are isosceles triangles, right? For E, let's just assume that the right triangle is Euclidean in this case. So right triangle and right triangle on which a square on the hypotenuse is equal to the contained area of the squares on the legs. So if we assume we have just Euclidean triangles, and they would have equal comprehension. And what about dog and animal? Well, dog definitely has greater comprehension than animal. Okay. So dog is a specific type of animal. We're narrowing things down. A dog has more specifying notes, one might say, so it has greater comprehension. So number 3, define extension, absolute extension, functional extension, inferior, and superior. So now remember, absolute extension refers to all the subjects of some term, all the members. So these subjects include all existing things referenced by a term's comprehension and all possible things referenced to it as well. Now, functional extension, that refers only to those subjects that someone has in mind during discourse. Someone can thereby refer to all the extension of a term, or some of the extension of the term, or reference a single subject of the term. Now, in terms of inferiors and superiors, they can be thought of as like proper subsets in mathematics in a way. So think of animal. Okay, it's best to think about this through an example. To think of animal, so it is the superior to man and dog because men and dogs are animals. Okay, they're members of that category animal. So in this, man and dog are called the inferiors, and the animal is the superior. So number 4, when we consider the extension of a term, do we prescind entirely from its comprehension? Explain. Okay. Well, I think the answer is no, because we can only consider the extension by reference to its comprehension. Otherwise, how can we say that these things belong to this or that concept? Okay. I can only say, well, that belongs to this because I know the comprehension of that particular category, right? So I don't think you can do that. Number 5, which term of each of the pairs given under question 2 has the greater absolute extension? Explain your answer, and so forth. So we want to know which has a greater absolute extension. So consider triangle and figure. Well, definitely figure has the greater absolute extension because the subjects that belong to figure are greater than those that just belong to triangle. Or consider like dog and animal. Well, clearly animal is a greater absolute extension. Okay, so just that, it's pretty straightforward. Or consider number 6, compare the members of each of the following groups in both comprehension and extension. So let's just think about what has like the largest extension, the smallest extension. So if you consider, for example, rectangle, figure, and plane figure, well, figure definitely has the smallest comprehension and the largest extension. But then, for example, consider plane figure. That has a larger comprehension than figure, and it has a smaller extension. Or think about rectangle. Okay. Of the 3, rectangle, figure, and plane figure, rectangle relatively has the largest comprehension and has the smallest extension, right? So that's kind of the way we would go about reasoning there. So this is an introduction to comprehension and extension. We worked through some exercises. I will leave a link to this book if you're interested in it, not only to Amazon but to archive.org, where you can just read this book in its entirety. I've only skimmed some of it, and I really like it. It's a really good book. That's not surprising. Jared Casey said it's a great book to start with if you're interested in traditional logic. And traditional logic is really a way where we can discipline our thinking. We can think more logically. Mathematical logic, symbolic logic is great, but there are certain things you're missing if you're only studying that. You really need the backing of traditional Aristotelian scholastic logic, and this is a great book to have. And I also want to remind you, if you go to amateurlogician.com and go to the blog with updates section, sooner or later you should encounter my interview with Professor Jared Casey there. And I recommend looking over that. And I'm very grateful that Professor Jared Casey agreed to this. He didn't have to. He did it out of his own generosity, and I'm very grateful for that. So I am the Amateur Logician, and visit my website. You can subscribe to my newsletter. I haven't sent much out. I send one thing out, but the thing is, there's a spam problem. And I realized that pretty much everyone was getting it to their spam folder. Everyone. So I asked a couple of friends on that and said, oh, they just got in their spam folder. They had no idea I sent out an email. And people have contacted me, and I've tried to reach back, and it also went to their damn spam folder, which is unfortunate. So I'm going to try to fix it if I can. But in any case, thanks for watching. I appreciate you sticking with me, and I'm sorry if I'm not the greatest communicator, the best speaker. I'm going to try to work on that and get better. But there's a lot to consider here. Anyways, thanks for watching. Until next time, be well.